You got the bill you've been dreading. You look at the number. You do the math in your head, and the math doesn't work. You owe more than you have. More than you'll have next month. The money is gone, and the person you owe it to wants it back. You have options. You can call your bank. You can file for Chapter 7. You can negotiate a payment plan. You can, in the absolute worst case, declare bankruptcy, have a judge discharge the debt, take the credit score hit, and start again. It will be painful. It will be humiliating. But in 3 to 7 years, legally, it's over. For the entire medieval period, roughly 1,000 years of European history, none of those options existed. Not one. There was no bankruptcy court. There was no legal mechanism to discharge a debt. There was no fresh start. If you owed money and couldn't pay, the system had a different set of outcomes in mind for you, and none of them involved a judge telling you the debt was gone. So, what happened to you? What actually happened in practice, in law, in your body when a medieval person ran out of money and couldn't pay what they owed? The answer involves imprisonment, the church, your own flesh, and a legal concept so brutal that its memory is still encoded in the English language. Let's start with what debt actually was in medieval Europe, because it wasn't what you think. In the early medieval period, most economic life happened at the local level, in villages, between people who knew each other and would continue to know each other for the rest of their lives. Historian Chris Dyer, in his work Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages, documents that the vast majority of English peasants lived within 10 miles of their birthplace for their entire lives. You borrowed money from your neighbour, your lord, or your priest. You would see these people every day. At church on Sunday, at the village well, at harvest. The social pressure to repay was not abstract, it was physical. It was constant, and it worked. Not because people were more virtuous, but because the cost of being known as someone who didn't pay was far higher than the cost of the debt itself. Manor court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries, the surviving legal records of village governance, are full of small debt disputes. A man owes 2 shillings for a pig. A widow owes 4 pence for grain. The amounts are tiny by any measure, but they were pursued relentlessly. Because in a world without credit scores, without financial histories, without any formal record of your economic character, your reputation was your credit. Destroy it once, and no one would lend to you again. The system enforced repayment through social suffocation. But what happened when social suffocation wasn't enough? What happened when the debt was large, when the debtor was a stranger, or when the creditor simply ran out of patience? This is where the body entered the picture. Medieval English law, formalised through statutes like the Statute of Acton Burnell in 1283 and the Statute of Merchants in 1285, gave creditors extraordinary power over debtors who defaulted. If you registered a debt with a royal official and the debtor failed to pay, the creditor could seize the debtor's goods, their land, and if goods and land were insufficient, the debtor themselves. This wasn't metaphorical. A defaulted debtor could be imprisoned in a royal gaol until the debt was paid or the creditor was satisfied. Notice what that meant in practice. You could not earn money in prison. You had no income. The debt accumulated no payment. There was no clock running on release. You stayed until someone, a family member, a friend, a charitable institution paid on your behalf. If no one paid, you stayed. Men died in medieval debtors' prisons not because the law sentenced them to death, but because the logic of the system made death the natural endpoint of a debt no one would cover. This is where the phrase paying in flesh stopped being a metaphor. Historians of medieval commerce, including Marianne Kowaleski in her research on English port towns, have documented that creditors could also, in some circumstances, claim a defaulted debtor's labour, not their freedom, technically, but their working hours, their productive capacity, effectively, their body. As repayment, you worked off what you owed, under conditions the creditor largely controlled. The distinction between this and indentured servitude was, in practice, very thin. And here the church enters, not as a rescuer, but as a complicating force. Canon law, the law of the church, had its own position on debt, and it created a collision that medieval debtors lived inside every day. On one hand, the church condemned usury, the charging of interest on loans, as a mortal sin. If your creditor had charged you interest, he was technically the sinner. There were ecclesiastical courts where this could be argued. There were cases brought before church tribunals in which debtors challenged the legitimacy of their debt on the grounds that the interest charged violated canon law. But the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the same council that mandated annual confession and transformed parish religious life, also affirmed the moral obligation to repay legitimate debts. You could not receive the Eucharist while in a state of unresolved dishonesty. An unrepaid debt, in the eyes of the Church, was a form of dishonesty. The confessional, the one place in medieval European life with something close to legal confidentiality, became the site where debtors disclosed what they owed, were counselled by priests on their obligation to repay, and were assigned penances specifically designed to motivate economic restitution. The Church was, in a deeply specific way, a debt collection institution. It simply used the afterlife as leverage instead of the sheriff. But medieval people were not passive in the face of this machinery. They developed strategies, some ingenious, some desperate, and all of them revealing about what it meant to live inside a system with no exit. The most documented strategy was the appeal to a social network. Medieval communities operated on what sociologist Marcel Mauss later called gift economies, systems of mutual obligation, reciprocal favour, and accumulated social debt that ran parallel to formal economic debt. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you called in every social obligation you had ever accumulated. The neighbour, whose child you'd fed in a hard winter. The guild brother whose stall you'd watched when he was sick. The cousin you'd helped build a barn. These were not formal debts, but they were real ones, and calling them in was both legitimate and expected. Guild records from medieval London, studied by historian Caroline Barron in her work on London civic life, show that guilds provided emergency funds for members facing insolvency. This was not charity. It was mutual insurance. You had paid into the guild. The guild paid out to you. The system worked because guild membership was a lifelong identity. You had an incentive to contribute because you might one day need to collect. The other strategy was sanctuary. Medieval England recognized the right of a debtor to claim sanctuary in a church or cathedral, sheltered from creditors and the law for 40 days. After 40 days, you had to leave, and when you left, the sheriff was waiting. But 40 days was long enough to negotiate, long enough for a family member to raise money, long enough for a creditor to decide that a settlement was better than the expense of continued litigation. Sanctuary was not a solution. It was 40 days of time bought inside consecrated walls while the world outside worked out whether it was worth destroying you. What none of these strategies could do was make the debt disappear. There was no mechanism for that. The concept of bankruptcy as a legal process, the formal acknowledgement that a debt is uncollectible, that the debtor is genuinely unable to pay, that the creditor must absorb the loss and the debtor must be released, did not exist in England until the Bankruptcy Act of 1542, and it was initially available only to merchants, not to ordinary people. For the entire medieval period, the assumption built into law, into canon law, and into the structure of social life was that a debt was permanent. It did not expire. It did not dissolve. It attached to you like a physical object, and it followed you. The word we still use for a person who cannot pay their debts is insolvent. Literally, in Latin, unable to be loosened, unable to be freed. They understood exactly what they were building. Here is what the mirror shows. We tell ourselves that bankruptcy is a form of civilizational progress, the compassionate acknowledgement that human beings make financial mistakes, that economic systems create casualties, that a person should not be imprisoned for the rest of their life because a venture failed or a medical bill exceeded what they could pay. And in formal terms, that is true. The legal architecture exists. The discharge is real. But the American bankruptcy system allows medical debt to destroy a person's financial life for years. Student debt is specifically exempted from discharge. The credit score, which functions exactly like a medieval reputation system, a public record of your economic character that follows you everywhere and shapes every transaction, drops catastrophically on the day you file and recovers only, slowly, across years, assuming you do everything correctly. You cannot see the inside of a debtor's prison, but you can lose your housing, your job prospects, your access to basic financial services, all simultaneously, in a country with no social floor beneath you. Medieval debtors had guild mutual funds, parish emergency relief, and the legal right to 40 days of sanctuary in which to negotiate. We replaced their brutality with paperwork and called it progress. The paperwork is real. The brutality is still there. It just doesn't require a sheriff anymore.